All right, so hey, good morning. Welcome to Fellowship. Thrilled that you're here. If you're watching online again this morning, glad that you're with us. Last week, if you were here, you know we began a new series. It's kind of a series that we're going to be working out throughout the summer, and it's a series on one of the greatest, or if not the greatest kings in the history of Israel. So David. So we're looking at David's life. And like I said last week, we're calling this series The Life of David just because I ran out of creative juices and that's all I could come up with, okay? So Life of David. Last week, what we did is we looked at a story, an event that catapulted David from a nobody shepherd boy into a national hero, okay? How he defeated the giant named Goliath and saved the Israelites from the Philistines. Now, today what we're going to do is we're going to look at another story from the early years of David's life. And what I mean by that is we're going to be looking at a story that happens before David becomes king, okay? But unlike last week's epic success, right? Like you can look at that story and say, hey, that's nothing but success. So unlike that one, today's story that we're looking at is a story of epic failure. See, David really essentially had two epic failures in his life that were written down for billions of people till the end of time to read. Eh? Like, how lucky is that guy, right? Like, man, so good for him. Now, one of those failures took place in his 50s, and we're going to be looking at that one later on, a couple weeks from now. That happened when he was the king. The other one happened actually quite early in his life when he was about 22 years old. And most of us probably don't know a lot about this one. We don't really know much about it, but it's a really fascinating story. And I think it teaches us some really important and relevant sort of lessons. Now, if you were here last week, and, you know, just by the way, if you weren't here last week, all of our content is available online. So you can just go to our website, click on the resources tab, go under there. You'll see a link for it. It's all available on YouTube, so you can get that. But if you were here, what you're going to do is you're going to remember that I said that David was one of my favorite characters in the Bible, right? Because I can go through, like, I love the Old Testament stories, and there's so many good ones. But David is one of my favorite characters. And not because, you know, he had a fairy tale sort of life, and not because David did everything right. In fact, it's just the opposite, right? Like, David struggled. Everything did not go his way. David made some epically huge mistakes. So David, when you look at him, when you read about his life in the Bible, you look at David, he's not a pillar of perfection. And I love that. That's why I resonate, like that. I kind of resonate with that because that's me. Like, I'm not a pillar of perfection. I don't get everything right. So I love David. And in many ways, here's the thing. Nowhere is this more clear to me and should be more clear to you than in the story that we're going to be looking at together here this morning. Because, see, in this story, we see David do something that all of us either have done, are currently doing, or will do at some point in the future. See, at some point, we all discover that following God and trusting and depending on God is the hardest and it's the most difficult, that the ways of God and how God works in our lives are the most frustrating and the most unappealing when we're angry, when we're isolated, and when we're afraid. Okay, so it doesn't matter who you are. David, you could be Greg, you could be Steve. You know, these are conditions that have the potential to undermine the commitments of even the most devout believer and follower of Jesus Christ. You know, these are the conditions that cause us to break all of those kind of boundaries that we've set up for ourselves. You say, okay, you know, that's my line. I'm not going to cross that. You know, whether that's a relational boundary, a physical boundary, a financial boundary, even a professional one, okay? And one of these, or maybe even a combination of these is likely a part of your greatest regret, the greatest regret that you have in life. You know, because if you think about something that you maybe regret saying, right? Or you think about something that you regret doing and you wish, you know, like, man, if I could just go back, right? Like, if I could just go back and have that moment, most likely one of these things was there. One of them, if not maybe all three of them, were actually a part of that moment. And the reason for that is because when we experience these kind of emotions, the emotions that get associated with this kind of stuff, our natural reaction Our natural sort of reactionary instinct is to do something about it, right? And we want to do anything that we can. When we're angry, when we're isolated and afraid, we want to do anything that we can to relieve the stress and the pain and the anxiety and the tension. And most of the time what happens is we go on instinct and we end up doing the wrong thing. And the result actually is that things don't really get better. Generally what happens is things get worse, right? So things don't get less complicated, things actually get more complicated, and then we actually end up more angry and more afraid and more isolated than we were before. Now, when David killed Goliath, he was 15 years old. Okay, young guy, 15 years old, and he instantly, that's why I used the word before, catapult, so he instantly becomes the most famous person in Israel. And so you got King Saul, and King Saul is an incredibly insecure guy, okay, incredibly insecure. And so he doesn't like the fact that David is becoming this real famous national hero. So he comes up with a plan to keep some control over David, because he doesn't want David becoming superhero-like, and then all of a sudden he wants to take over the kingdom, and then he pushes Saul out, right? So Saul needs to control him. And so Saul comes up with this plan. He says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try and bring David into my family. Okay? I'm going to probably bring David in my family. So he offers one of his daughters to David in marriage, but David refuses. This is what David said. David said, who am I and what is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law? So in other words, he's saying, look, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy to become the king's son-in-law. I'm not from a famous family. I'm not from a rich family. I'm just a nobody. So I don't think I'm worthy. And so Saul's plan is not working out quite right here, and it turns out that David's rejection of Saul's offer of marriage here just made people like him even more. Because these people just love this real humble kid, right? He's a national hero, but he's super humble. But here's the thing. In time, David actually did fall in love with one of Saul's daughters. So Saul tried to orchestrate the marriage. It didn't work out. It turns out that David did fall in love with one of his daughters named Michal. So they got married, and he also ends up becoming best friends with Saul's son Jonathan. Okay, so Saul is actually getting exactly what he wants, and he's thinking, okay, this is great because now he's my son-in-law, he's best friends with my son. There's no way he's going to take over the kingdom. But it turns out that this actually is a really bad idea, because David actually just becomes more powerful and more influential and more loved by everyone around him, and now that actually includes Saul's family, okay, and all of his officials. So Saul is kind of beside himself, and after 7 years of this, out of sheer jealousy, Saul decides to get rid of him. He's got to go with plan B, okay? Decides to get rid of him. But Saul doesn't personally want to be responsible for killing the national hero. Doesn't really look good, okay? And so what he does is he starts sending David out on these impossible, ridiculous missions into Philistine territory to do these crazy missions that almost anybody else going out would certainly die doing. But every time David goes out, he comes back. He carries out the mission, and the people love him even more. So Saul moves to plan C, and he decides secretly to have David arrested. But every time he tries, his own son Jonathan and his daughter Michal, they help him escape. And so his resentment of David, it builds and it builds and it builds until David doesn't show up for dinner one night. Now you got to understand, dinner with a king, that was a big deal. That was huge. In ancient times, if you ate at the king's table, that was a very big honor. And David, being the king's son-in-law, would have done that. But for the past couple of years, when things were really bad between them, David just wouldn't show up, right? And I think all of you understand that. If things aren't good at home, sometimes you just don't want to show up for dinner, right? And so Jonathan would always be at the table, and he was good friends with David, so he would often make excuses for him. But this one particular night, Saul lost it. So in 1 Samuel 20, it says this. It says, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman." Now, I don't know who was all at the table, but I sure hope Jonathan's mom wasn't sitting there, Talk about awkward dinner, okay? So Saul says, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? Man, they got some marriage issues. Wow. Some counseling is going to be necessary there. So as long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, and you got to understand, here's the real issue. This is what's coming up. Neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Okay, so Saul's the first king of Israel. Okay, and Saul wants his legacy. He wants his family's status to last. Jonathan is the guy in line, right? He's the guy that's going to carry on that legacy. David is the guy in the way. And so he says, now send someone to bring David to me, for he must die. So Jonathan goes out and he finds David, and what he actually does is he warns David, okay? And he tells him not just to leave town, but David, you got to leave the country. You got to. And so here's David, 22 years old, and suddenly David's afraid for his life. And he's completely alone. He's been rejected by the man that he's risked his life for. And he's done absolutely nothing to deserve it. He's done nothing wrong. So he's abandoned, he's angry, and he's afraid. And so what does David do? Well, David did what many of us do when we feel like that. He panicked. And he took matters into his own hands. Now, I think, it may be a little bit hard for us coming off that story of Goliath, right? To imagine David losing sight of the fact that God was with him. Like, that was huge, right? Like, God slayed this giant. It was an incredible act of faith. Like, 15-year-old shepherd boy slays the giant. And David's sitting there, in you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. Like, we're going to slay him. It's hard to imagine that David would lose sight of that. And it's hard to understand why David, in this moment, would panic. And why he would abandon all of his morals. But here's the thing. I can't help but think that there are probably people out there, the people that maybe some work colleagues or your neighbors or whatever, family members. There are people out there who would watch us today and look at our lives, and they probably think the same thing, right? They'll watch us struggle or go through something, and they'll wonder, why do you do that? Why are you doing that? Like, you're a Christian, right? Like, you believe in God. Why would you respond that way? Right? And how many of you can actually, go back, like you look back at a time in your life and you wonder to yourself, why did I do that? Like, why did I go there? Why did I say yes to that invitation? Why did I spend that money? Why did I just run from that situation? And when you really break it down and you think about it, the answer is almost always you either felt alone, angry, or afraid. And when we feel that way, the natural tendency for us is to panic. And that's what David does. That's what David does here. It says this. It says, David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Now, this is pre-Jerusalem as the capital of Israel kind of days. Okay, so when David becomes king, he makes Jerusalem the capital. So this is pre-Jerusalem, pre-temple days. And at that point in time, the center of Jewish worship was wherever the tabernacle was, right? So that's the tabernacle they built out in the wilderness, and they're carting around with them wherever they're going. And often the tabernacle would be on the move as they were in this new land, often to the safest city, okay, away from enemies. And so the safest city at this point is the city of Nob. So David goes to Ahimelech, the chief priest. And Ahimelech, he sees David coming in, and it says that he trembles. He trembles, and he says to David, he says, David, why are you all by yourself? Because that usually didn't happen, right? Like, David usually traveled with a whole army. He had a whole bunch of warriors with him. But here, he's all by himself. And he's probably looking a little bit worse for wear, right? Because he had to run. Jonathan said, you got to get out of here. So he didn't have a chance to pack his bags, so to speak. And so he says to David, he says, David, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? And David, this is the guy who knows God's law, who loves God's law, and trusted in God wholeheartedly to save him from the giant. In this instinctive moment, just flat out lies. Why? Because he's afraid, and he's hungry, and he's alone. And when you feel that way, the ways of God often just happen to go by the wayside, right? And so this is what he says. He says, well, the king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on. So he just flat out lies, right, about being on this secret mission. And then he says, as for my men, well, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. So not only is it a lie, but it's a crappy one. Like, that's a terrible lie. Like, seriously, think, David? Come on, that's the best you can come up with? I'm on a secret mission, and I'll meet my men at a certain place? But if he tells them the truth, Ahimelech isn't going to help. He's not going to help, and so he lies. And that lie, we're going to see this later on, but that lie is going to have devastating, absolutely devastating consequences for Ahimelech and his family. So David lies, and then he asks Ahimelech, he says, now what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find, because he's hungry and David's got nothing. And Ahimelech has got a sense like, man, this is so weird. He's coming by himself. He's looking worse for wear. He doesn't have food. And he says he's on a mission for a king. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Something's not right. But at the same time, David is the king's son-in-law, right? He's one of the king's men. So he says, well, David, I don't have any ordinary bread here. But I do have some consecrated bread. See, every Sabbath, what would happen is the priests would make fresh bread. They would put it on the altar as an offering to the Lord. And when the Sabbath was over, they would take the bread, and the priests then would keep it for themselves, and they would eat it. But you couldn't just give it to anyone because it's like considered consecrated bread, which meant that you had to be ceremonially clean in order to be able to eat it. And so he says to David, he says, look, David, like, you want bread, but we don't have any bread. We don't have normal bread. We just have this consecrated bread. And David says, well, David lies again. And he says, well, that's okay. That just works out. How fortunate, because the guys and I are holy and we're pure. We've been made pure. So David not only lied about why he was there, he also lied to get food. And you think about that, and you're like, man, like, what happened to the guy, right? What happened to the guy who said, in you, Lord my God, I put my trust? What happened to him? Like, my hope is in you all day long. Where did that David go? Where did the confident and yet humble David go? So David takes the bread. And then he asks Ahimelech if he's got a sword or a spear. And Ahimelech now, he's got to be cluing in now, right? Like, he knows for sure something is going on. Because why would the most famous warrior in the nation show up by himself without food, looking completely worn out, and without his weapon? You're on a secret mission for the king without your weapon? Now, what happens next here should have been a total, absolute, like, wake-up call for David. Okay, should have been a wake-up call. The moment where David just stopped and said, oh man, like, what am I doing? What am I thinking? This is like, I'm going crazy here. Because see, when David asked for a sword or spear, Ahimelech said this. He said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed 7 years ago in the valley of Elah, is here. And it's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one. Now, initially, David had taken that sword as a souvenir, but then later, out of gratitude to God, he decided that he was going to give it back to God and dedicate it to him. So he gave it to the high priest, and basically that was David's way of saying, God, look, I recognize that I did not deliver myself. You delivered me. God, you delivered me. So I'm giving this to you as a reminder to all of Israel, to myself, but to all of Israel, that we're depending on you. And so David is suddenly, in this moment, he's suddenly reminded of that event. And the memories, I'm sure, they just come flooding back. That moment where this, little 15-year-old, clear-eyed, courageous, God-fearing shepherd boy looked at the giant, battle-hardened warrior and said this, you come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord. And he's going to give you into my hands. And I am not afraid because he is with me. And my trust is in him all day long. And then he pulled out his sling and a stone and he let it fly, and that giant hit the ground. That sword should have been a wake-up call for David. But the fear and the anger and the isolation were just too overwhelming. And instead what he does is he takes the sword, takes it with him, and he keeps just doing things his own way. And see, this is where I think our stories start to really connect with David's. See, often when we need God, we're most tempted to go the other direction, to run away from him towards things that never worked before and that just often lead to regret. You know, and it's really easy, you know this, like it's really easy to see other people doing that, right? To see them making decisions, you know, out of anger or fear. And you know, like you're watching it and you know, like it's just going to make things worse, right? And it's going to create more regret in their life. And it's easy to see that in others and to say, boy, you're going down the wrong path. But it's almost impossible to see that in yourself. Because in that moment, like when we're in that moment, we are absolutely, and you know this, but we're 100% convinced that our situation is unique, right? That our situation is different and that people just don't understand. And that we think that if God were with me, like if God were really, really with me in this wouldn't be happening to me. See, I have a tendency to think that it's easier to trust in God when you have nothing to trust him with. Okay? Now, when you're young and you say, hey, God, I love you. I want to do whatever you want me to do. I just want to give you my whole life. That's pretty easy to say when you really don't have a lot to give him. Like, you know what I mean? Like you got the stuff in your room, right? Maybe you got a car and maybe it's not even your car. And I'm not trying to downplay anything here, but I'm just saying it's easier to trust in God when you have nothing to trust him with and nothing to trust him for. It's easier to trust God and it's easier to pray to God. It's easier to serve God when things are going well in your life. It's a whole lot harder to trust him when things in our life don't go well, and when the things that we've valued and when life becomes so much more complex, when those things start to slip away and they start becoming hard. Because this is what I mean, like it's really easy to be critical of David, right? To look at David and you're like, oh, come on, David. Like, how are you missing this? But we all do this. We all do this. So David takes Goliath's sword and he knows he's got to leave the country. So guess where he goes? Okay, and this just goes to show you how unclear his thinking is. Like David is kind of losing it. Of all the places, he decides to hide out among the Philistines with Goliath's sword. And he goes to the city of Gath, which is where Goliath was from. Like this is totally insane. Okay, it's totally insane. He's panicking, he's afraid, he's not making clear decisions at all. So he goes to the Philistine king, and go figures, they recognize him. Shocker, right? Like what gave him away? What do you think it was? Maybe the sword? Was it those constant raids that Saul was sending you on, right? Like that annoyed them to no end? So now David is right in the heart of Philistine territory. They all recognize him, and he's really afraid. Like he's panicking because he's surrounded by enemies. And so David figures that his best option is to actually pretend to be insane, which he might as well be because he's been acting that way, so go for it. And so he starts scratching his nails on the wood, and he starts slobbering all over himself, and the Philistine king looks at him and says, this guy's gone crazy. He's gone crazy. And he throws him out. And thank goodness, because they would have taken his life, and so they throw him out, and David ends up in a cave, all alone, angry, and afraid. And in that cave, over time, as people come to him, David finally starts to come to his senses. And he decides that he's going to go back to his own country. And he goes and he finds a prophet. And when he meets that prophet, essentially he's saying, like, look, I've really messed up. I want to know now what God wants me to do. Would you speak to God for me? It's the right move. It's the right move. But unfortunately, the damage has already been done. Because see, Saul found out about David's conversation with Ahimelech from a guy named Doeg, who saw it happen but didn't hear it, didn't really hear it happen. We know how that works. And he went and he told Saul that he saw it, and it made things look really, really bad for Ahimelech. And Saul, being, that extremely temperamental, jealous type, called Ahimelech and his family in. And no matter how much Ahimelech tried to explain what happened and how he didn't know anything about what was going on with David and the issues there, Saul said to him, "You will surely die, you and your whole family." Because why? Saul's afraid, and he's angry, and he's alone. So 85 priests died that day. And then Saul went to Nob and wiped out the entire town. And the only one who survived was the son of Ahimelech named Abiathar, who fled to David, told him the whole story. And David hears the story, and David just breaks down. And he confesses to him. He says, I am responsible for the death of your entire family, for the death of an entire village. Why? Because he didn't trust God. Because he panicked, and he took matters into his own hands. See, there will come a time in all of your lives when your anger will push you to do something that you shouldn't do. There will come a time when your fear and your loneliness will make you fantasize about things that you would immediately tell other people not to do, but somehow it becomes an option for you because you'll do anything to get rid of the feelings that you have and that you're experiencing. And so my question for you is this: what is your loneliness, anger, or fear causing you to think about doing that you would have never considered before? It may be something relational, maybe something financial, maybe something, physical. What sort of risk would you never in your life have dreamed of ever taking before, but now you're thinking about it? Like maybe you're this close to falling back into an old habit that you worked incredibly hard to get rid of, but you're that close to falling into it. Who is your loneliness and anger and fear causing you to consider that you shouldn't? Maybe that person that that you shouldn't call or that you shouldn't text because, she's made it clear that she wants something, or he's made it clear that he wants something, and you've stayed away, but because of what's going on at home and the struggles you're having in your life, you're finding it hard, right? You're really considering doing it, sending that text. David completely missed the wake-up call that God gave him. And the consequences for missing that were huge. And I don't want that for you, and I certainly don't want it for me. And so here's the wake-up call question for you. Who besides you do the things that you're thinking of doing put at risk? Who do they put at risk? Who besides you do these options that were never options before, but suddenly are options now? Who do they put at risk? And of course, here's the thing. You already know the answer to this, okay? You already know the answer because it's always the people that you love the most, right, who are at risk. And I don't know, maybe you've experienced that growing up. Parents who out of anger and fear, who, things just got out of control, and you've been dealing with the repercussions of that in your life ever since, right? So besides yourself, whose future is at risk? And then think for a moment, what advice would you give someone in that situation? What would you tell yourself in that moment? Now, we know the advice that David would give himself, that he would give us. We know that kind of advice. And not 22-year-old David, but grown up King David. Because see, later in his life, David would journal about his experience and what he learned. And here's what David would say. In Psalm 9, he said this. He said, "The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed." The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. Not alcohol, okay? Not another person, not a new car or house or anything like that. The Lord is a refuge, a stronghold in times of trouble. God is the place that you run to. Your relationship with God is the relationship you run to when you feel oppressed, when there are times of trouble in your life. David would say, look, I took refuge. You got to understand, like I'm talking about personal experience. David says, I took refuge in my ability to try to control the outcome, to control things. That's what I wanted. And the outcome, you know what it was? It was a complete and epic disaster. And so in verse 10, he says, those who know your name trust in you, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. So in other words, I thought I had been forsaken, right? Because my life was tough and difficult, and Saul was trying to kill me. I thought I had been forsaken, that none of this would be happening to me if God was with me. But I realize now that God was always with me. So don't make the same mistake that I made. In times of trouble, don't run away from God. You got to run straight to God. Don't take matters into your own hands. Place your troubles in His. You know, 1,000 years after this event, David's most famous descendant came into the world. Okay? And he looked into the eyes of some very frightened, very angry, very isolated and afraid and abandoned Israelites. And he said something to them that was not only intended for them, but it's intended for each and every single one of you sitting here this morning. This is what he said. He said, come to me. Jesus said, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke, take my perspective, take my worldview upon you, and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And you will find rest for your souls. See, I want you to know that no matter what you feel, and despite all the evidence to the contrary, that God is with you. And there is no greater proof. Like if you're doubting that, and I know we all go through those seasons, right? Like we reach those seasons of doubt. There's no greater proof of that than Jesus, who came into this world and gave up his life for you and gave up his life for me so that God could always be with us, both right now but also forever. And if you believe that, and if you remind yourself of that rather than panic and react, you're going to find rest in your soul. You know, David would say, when I saw the sword of Goliath, like take it from me, when I saw the sword of Goliath, I should have remembered that. I should have remembered it, that God is faithful and is powerful and will never forsake those he loves and all those who come to him. And so if you're in that place right now and you find and when you find yourself in that place, when you feel afraid and when you feel angry and when you feel alone, don't panic and don't react. Just remember the love and the sacrifice of Jesus. That's what you got to do in that moment. You got to focus on it. You got to pray for it. You got to sing about it. You got to read about it until you know it again in your heart, that the Lord is a refuge for the oppressed and a stronghold in times of trouble. That the Lord is your stronghold in times of trouble. As much as you may want to take matters into your own hands, you have to promise and you've got to pray. This is what you got to promise and pray, okay? God, I am not going to move without you. I'm not going to move without you. And as long as I feel betrayed, and as long as I feel afraid, and as long as I feel angry, I will come to you. And I won't move without you. I will not embrace what I've considered, because even though I feel as if I have been forsaken, I acknowledge that it was a mistake, because you are always, always with me. Let's pray. Our Lord and God, I thank you that you are always with us. God, that in the midst of our greatest struggles and hurts and pains, God, that you are there. Lord, David, oh man, some of us, God, all of us, we can't even imagine what it was like to be David, to be on the run for your life, people throwing spears at us. And God, we can't even imagine what that is like. But God, in some ways, we do know in our own lives what it's like to feel isolated and abandoned and to feel angry and afraid. Like we've all experienced things in our lives that push us into those kind of moments. And we're in those moments, our natural reaction is to try to get out of it. And so we panic and we react. And often the things that we do in those moments and the things that we say just make things worse. And just lead to greater levels of isolation, panic, Lord, and anger and fear. And so, God, I pray that when we are in those moments, Lord, I pray that we'll learn the lesson from David, Lord, that David's words will just ring true in our heads and in our hearts. And, Lord, that when we reach those moments, we'll remember that when David took matters into his hands, the outcome was disastrous, epically disastrous. And David, years later in life, looked at that situation and said, man, was I wrong? Because the Lord is a refuge. He is a refuge for the oppressed. He will never abandon the ones he loves. And so I pray that we will know that. And when we get into those moments, our reaction will not to be to run away from you and take matters into our own hands. Our reaction will be to run to you. And that we will make this promise and that we will say that prayer. In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. You are a refuge for the oppressed, and I will not move while I am angry, while I feel isolated, while I feel afraid. I will not move unless you come with me. Because God, when we come to you and we know that you're there, those feelings of anger, isolation, and fear subside. Because you never forsake those you love. We see that through your Son, Jesus Christ. And as they subside, then we are in the place to be able to move with you and in a way that honors you. God, help us to say that prayer and to make that commitment to you. In Jesus' name we pray.